Hello and welcome to the world of literature. I am your host with the series 100 FN. In 100 FN, we have been dealing with 100 most famous novels from English literature, and we have so far dealt with the novels from 17th century, from Victorian era, and now we have reached modern age. And we are dealing with the novel from the modern age. We have so far dealt with the novels of D.H. Lawrence, we have dealt with the novels of James Joyce, and now we are taking up the novels of Virginia Woolf. Now, today we'll be dealing with one of the novels of Virginia Woolf. Now, as is the tradition at the world of literature, that we engage our viewers with clues that they can guess which novel we are going to take up for a particular lecture. So, regarding today's novel, on your screen would be the clues of today's novel. This novel is the best expression of stream of consciousness narration. The novel deals with the events of one single day, that's Wednesday in the month of June 1923. The novel is created from two short stories, Mrs. Dalloway in the Bond Street and the Prime Minister. In 2005, the novel was selected as the best in the list of 100 best novels written since 1920. So these were the clues about today's novel, and if you have not guessed the novel that we are going to discuss in this particular lecture, let us tell you that at the world of literature today we will be dealing with Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. Now the lecture is divided into various sections. Now we deal with the section of clues, and up next would be the section dealing with characters from the novel. Before we take up the plot, it's imperative that we have a look at the characters from the novel. Now on your screen would be a slide consisting of the characters from the novel Mrs. Dalloway. Now the characters are Clarissa Dalloway, she is the protagonist of the novel, and we have Richard Dalloway, he is the husband of Mrs. Dalloway. We have Elizabeth, she is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Dalloway, and the second storyline would be dealt by Septimus Warren-Smith. He is the protagonist of the second story from Mrs. Dalloway. He is described as a soldier who fought in World War I. Lucrezia, she is the wife of Septimus. She is described as the Italian wife of Septimus. Sir William Bradshaw is a psychiatrist. Peter Walsh is described as the ex-suitor of Mrs. Dalloway. After dealing with the characters from the novel, let's take up the plot of the novel Mrs. Dalloway. Now, coming to the plot of the novel Mrs. Dalloway is a unique novel in the sense that it takes place in one single day, that is Wednesday in June 1923. Now this was one of the characteristics of the modern novel, that the setting is based on one single day. And you know of James Joyce's novel Ulysses, which is set in one single day. And another best example of such narrative is Mrs. Dalloway. The novel deals with two seemingly unconnected storylines, two unconnected plots during this single day, that is Wednesday. Now, as the novel begins, we are introduced to the protagonist from the novel, that is Mrs. Dalloway. Now, Mrs. Dalloway is told to be a woman or a lady of 50 years or so, and she has recently recovered from an illness. Now, having regained her health, she is preparing for a party which she will host that evening. Now, this is one of the events from the day Wednesday on which the story would be based. Now, she begins her day by running an errand to purchase the flowers for the party. She goes for the shopping, and after returning from the shopping, Clarissa begins mending her green silk dress for the evening when she receives an unexpected visit from Peter Walsh, her former suitor. Now, Peter Walsh had once told Clarissa disparagingly that one day she would become the perfect hostess, and it becomes more and more clear that his prediction was accurate. Both Peter Walsh and Mrs. Dalloway, they have a normal conversation. Peter Walsh asks her if she is happy with the decision of marrying Richard Dalloway. But before Mrs. Dalloway could have replied to his question, they are interrupted by Elizabeth, the daughter of Mrs. Dalloway. She enters and their meeting ends abruptly. Now, Peter Walsh exits from the scene, and throughout the morning, Clarissa reflects on her past, including her decision to marry Richard Dalloway some 30 years earlier rather than her more fiery suitor, Peter Walsh. Meanwhile, the narrative shifts to the second storyline, to the second plot, with focus on Septimus Warren-Smith. Now, Septimus Warren-Smith is described as a shell-shocked war veteran out on the streets with his wife, Lucrezia. Now, Septimus struggles with the after effects of the war, hearing voices and feeling that life has but little meaning. Meanwhile, a car backfiring paralyzes him, and he reflects on his life. Mrs. Dalloway, on the other hand, is thinking about the void that exists between people, even between husband and wife. Though she values the privacy she is able to maintain in her marriage, considering it to be vital for the success of her relationship, but she also finds slightly disturbing the fact that Richard doesn't know everything about her. Now, after giving a thought to this, Clarissa goes to see off Elizabeth, her daughter. Now, Elizabeth is studying with her tutor, Doris Gilman. Doris Gilman is despised by Clarissa as she sees in him the monster with hooves who is taking her daughter away from her. Doris also despises Clarissa largely for her bourgeois ways and financial means. Meanwhile, the story focuses on Septimus, Warren-Smith and Lucrezia. Now they have returned to their apartment and are waiting for the attendants who will take Septimus Warren-Smith to the asylum. Now when they arrive, Septimus decides to escape from them, for he doesn't want to go to the asylum. However, Septimus also does not want to die, he wants to leave. But since that he has got no choice, either he has to die or he has to go to asylum. Now in this confusion, Septimus Warren-Smith chooses death over going to the asylum, and he jumps out of the window and dies. Now it is at this point that the first narrative one of the stories from Mrs. Dalloway come to an end. Now, after the conclusion of one of the plots from Mrs. Dalloway, that is Septimus Warren-Smith and Lucrezia, this plot ended with the death of Septimus Warren-Smith. The story would now focus on Mrs. Clarissa as she is organizing a party in the evening. She would be host of the party, and eventually or finally the party has begun at Clarissa's home, and several guests from her past, including Peter Walsh, Sari Saturn, have arrived. Richard, on the other hand, has still not been able to tell her that he loves her. Now, besides other, Sir William Bradshaw and Lady Bradshaw are also invited to the party, but they reach very late in the party, or they arrive very late and are apologetic for their tardiness and for being late. Since William Bradshaw and Lady Bradshaw, they arrive late in the party, Lady Bradshaw explains that they were delayed as one of the patients of Sir William Bradshaw, now referring to Septimus Warren-Smith, had committed suicide that day. Now, Mrs. Dalloway was listening to Lady Bradshaw, and when she came to know about the suicide of Septimus Warren-Smith, she retires to the privacy of a small room to consider Septimus's death. She understands that he was overwhelmed by life and that men like Sir William Bradshaw make life intolerable. She identifies with Septimus, admiring him for having taken the plunge and for not compromising his soul. Now, this is something that is different in Virginia Woolf, because when we deal with the novels from the modern age, for example, Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence, or for example, Woman in Love from D.H. Lawrence, we come to know that the characters from these novels, they choose life over death. For example, Paul Morrell in Sons and Lovers, at the end of the novel, though he has a slight idea of he thinks about committing suicide, but later thinks that it is better to lead life rather than commit suicide. And also in Woman in Love, when Gerald commits suicide, Birkin later thinks that Gerald must not have died. But in this particular novel, we find that it is Mrs. Dalloway who thinks that he did a right thing by committing suicide. And she feels that with her comfortable position as a society hostess, she is also responsible for the death of Septimus Warren Smith. Now, the second event of the novel, that is the party, is heading towards the close as the guests begin to leave. Clarissa enters the room and her presence fills Peter Walsh with great excitement. Now, as the party comes to an end, Mrs. Dalloway thinks that she has not become a good host. And it is at this point that Mrs. Dalloway ends. So that was about the plot of the novel Mrs. Dalloway. We dealt with two stories. One was the story of Septimus Warren Smith and the other was the story of Mrs. Dalloway. From Septimus Warren Smith, we had an idea of how World War One affected the people in England, or in particular the soldiers who participated in this war, and that mental derailness of Septimus tells everything about the aftermaths of World War One. And the other thing that we dealt with was the complications in the life of Mrs. Dalloway. Even in her 50s, we are not clear whether she is happy with her marriage with Richard Dalloway, or she is still thinking about Peter Walsh, whether she should have chosen Peter Walsh or Richard Dalloway. And we also deal with the lives of the other characters. And another thing that we found in this novel was the character of Sir William Bradshaw. Now remember, when we are in the modern period where we are dealing with the modern novel, now the doctor is replaced by the psychiatrist, because the narrative is stream of consciousness. We are no more dealing with the physical aspects of the characters, rather we are dealing with the psychological aspects of the characters. And recently Sigmund Freud had written his psychological thesis, psychological theories, and those psychoanalysis was, on the rise, and people were even interpreting the Sons and Lovers from Freudian angle, and that is why even the novelists would take a psychiatrist in place of a doctor. So that was all from the plot of the novel Mrs. Dalloway. So, having dealt the plot of the novel Mrs. Dalloway, in the next section we would be reviewing the story or the plot of the Mrs. Dalloway. Mrs. Dalloway and Septimus Warren Smith. Mrs. Dalloway is a 50-year-old woman. She is preparing for a party which will be hosted by her in the evening. She begins her day with shopping. Peter Walsh makes an unexpected visit at her home. Their conversation is interrupted by Elizabeth, and Peter leaves. She thinks about her marriage with with Mr. Dalloway and about her past suitor Peter Walsh in the morning. Later, the story shifts to Septimus, a war veteran suffering from mental illness. Septimus lost his friend in the war and continues to converse with him. Clarissa thinks about her friend Sally Saturn and also hints at lesbian relationship with her. Peter Walsh sees Septimus and Lucrezia in the park. They are having an argument over suicide, and Peter considers them a young couple quarreling. They have an appointment with Sir William Bradshaw, a psychiatrist, who diagnoses Septimus with serious mental illness and directs his admission in mental asylum. We are introduced to Richard Dalloway, who is having lunch with Lady Burton. Richard realizes that he should express his love with Mrs. Dalloway, but fails. Mrs. Dalloway thinks about the void in human relationships, even between husband and wife. She thinks that it's strange that Richard does not know everything about her. She sees off Elizabeth with her tutor Doris Kilman. She considers Kilman a monster with hooves. And Kilman in return despises her for Borgia's outlook on life. Septimus and Lucrezia are waiting for the attendants who will take Septimus to asylum. Now, Septimus does not want to die, but can't live in asylum, thus jumps over window and dies. Party begins at Mrs. Dalloway's home, and Peter and Sally Saturn enter. Mr. Bradshaw and Lady Bradshaw make a late entry and are apologetic for being late. Lady Bradshaw says that they were late because Septimus had committed suicide. Upon hearing this, Clarissa retires to a private room and thinks that Septimus did right by committing suicide because people like Bradshaw won't let him leave. People begin to leave, party is over, and Mrs. Dalloway thinks she has not become a successful host. Now, after reviewing the story of Mrs. Dalloway, let's have a look at the ending of the novel. How does the novel look at the end? Well, Septimus Warren Smith, one of the protagonists, is dead. Party hosted by Mrs. Dalloway is over. Mrs. Dalloway thinks she has not become a good host. Richard Dalloway fails to express his love to Mrs. Dalloway. Peter Walsh, who is now in love with Daisy, a married woman in India, he plans to marry her. That was all from the today's lecture on 100 FN. Today we dealt with Mrs. Dalloway. I hope you liked the lecture. For more interesting lectures and valuable information on literature, keep watching The World of Literature and don't forget to like, share and subscribe. You can also write us back at tworldofliterature@gmail.com and your queries would be appreciated. Thank you for watching.